In the mist-shrouded dawn of the 10th century, the concept of a unified England was a fragile dream held by the House of Wessex. Prince Athelstan, the eldest son of Edward the Elder, stands atop the Roman walls of Londinium. He is not yet a king, but a commander of destiny, watching the confluence of Saxon and Viking cultures. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and the weight of legacy. Here, the lineage begins not with effortless luxury, but with the cold steel of responsibility and the relentless burden of defending a fractured realm against the northern tide. A century later, the Norman conquest transformed the very blood of the monarchy. William the Conqueror's sons, Robert Curthose and William Rufus, engage in a tense hunt within the New Forest. This is a world of sharp contrasts, the rugged discipline of the conqueror versus the entitled ambition of his heirs. The brothers do not look at each other, their eyes fixed on the path ahead, representing the fractured unity that would define the Norman dynasty. The forest floor is a labyrinth of ancient oaks, whispering of the violent transition from Saxon lords to French-speaking overlords. The year 1120 marks a chilling pivot in the royal line. Prince William Adelin, the sole legitimate heir to Henry I, boards the ill-fated White Ship. The scene captures the final moments of revelry before the disaster strikes the rocks of Barfleur. Gold chalices glint under the moonlight as the prince laughs, unaware that his death will plunge England into decades of civil war known as the Monarchy. This is the first great vacancy of the crown, where the promise of a peaceful succession vanishes into the icy, churning waters of the English Channel. As the anarchy ravages the countryside, the young Henry Fitz-Empress, later Henry II, is forged in the fires of survival. We see him in a secluded scriptorium, studying maps of a kingdom torn between his mother Matilda and his cousin Stephen. The flickering candlelight reflects off his determined brow. He is a prince in exile, learning that power is not inherited, but seized through administrative genius and iron will. The room is cluttered with heavy vellum scrolls and wax seals, symbolizing the legalistic framework he would eventually impose upon a lawless land. The rise of the Plantagenets brings an unprecedented spectacle: the coronation of the young king. Henry the young king is crowned while his father still lives, an attempt to ensure stability that instead breeds resentment. In the Great Hall of Westminster, the prince is draped in heavy ermine, his face a mask of premature gravity. The air is heavy with incense and the hushed murmurs of a court that fears his volatile ambition. This scene depicts the literal weight of the crown as a physical burden, foreshadowing the rebellion against his own father. Richard the Lionheart, the second son, represents the prince as a crusader warrior. He is depicted in a coastal fortress, looking toward the Mediterranean. His armor is functional and battle-worn, reflecting his preference for the camp over the court. Unlike his brother, he finds no joy in English politics, seeing the kingdom merely as a treasury for his overseas ambitions. The scene captures the transition of the English prince from a domestic ruler to a global icon of chivalry, setting a standard of martial prowess that his successors would struggle to emulate. The shadow of Prince John looms as he negotiates with rebellious barons in the marshy meadows of Runnymede. This is not a scene of triumph, but of begrudging concession. John, a prince who spent his life in his brother's shadow, is surrounded by armored men holding the Great Charter. The atmosphere is thick with tension and the damp mist of the Thames. Here, the absolute power of the royal prince is checked for the first time, marking the beginning of a long fall from divine right toward constitutional limitation. Henry III's reign began in the cradle, making him a prince defined by his minority. We see him as a small boy sitting on the massive coronation chair, his feet dangling far above the floor. He is surrounded by powerful regents who pull the strings of the state. This scene illustrates the vulnerability of the boy prince, a recurring theme in British history, where the crown is a target for ambitious guardians. The vast, empty space of the abbey emphasizes his isolation and the crushing expectations placed upon a child in a world of wolves. Edward I, known as Longshanks, reshapes the role of the heir by becoming the first Prince of Wales. In the rugged terrain of North Wales, he surveys the construction of Caernarfon Castle. The prince is a giant of a man, his presence as imposing as the iron-gray stone being hoisted into place. He is the architect of a new English identity, one built on conquest and the systematic subjugation of the British Isles. The scene is one of industrial scale and cold calculation, where masonry and muscle forge a new era of princely dominion. The cycle of the prince ends its first millennium with the tragic contrast of Edward II. In the opulent but stifling court, the young prince turns away from the traditional pursuits of war and governance, finding solace in the company of his favorites like Piers Gaveston. He is shown in a private solar, surrounded by fine tapestries and lutes, ignoring the heavy broadsword leaning against the wall. This scene marks the beginning of the fall of the traditional warrior prince, replaced by a man whose personal desires would eventually lead to his brutal deposition and ruin. Transitioning from his father's struggles, Edward of Woodstock, known as the Black Prince, emerges as the apex of chivalry. He stands on the battlefield of Crecy, not in triumph, but in somber reflection amidst the silence after the storm. He embodies the paradox of the prince warrior, a man who serves his father, Edward III, with absolute loyalty while carving his own legend in dark plate armor. The establishment of the Order of the Garter signals a shift toward a formalized, elite military brotherhood. His life is a blueprint for the martial heir, defined by the weight of a helmet and the code of honor. The boy king Richard II faces his first existential crisis at Smithfield during the Peasants' Revolt. At only 14, the Prince King confronts the massive, angry mob led by Wat Tyler after his advisors falter. This moment defines the divine right of kings as a shield. Richard rides forward alone, his youthful voice cutting through the smoke of a burning London. He is a slender figure against a backdrop of pitchforks and fire, a prince who believes his blood makes him invincible. This scene captures the transition from medieval feudalism to the volatile power of the urban masses. The narrative shifts to the wild youth of Henry of Monmouth, the future Henry V. In the dim light of a tavern, the prince is shown discarding his tankard as he gazes at his reflection in a polished shield. He is shedding the skin of Prince Hal, the riotous companion of commoners, to embrace the cold, steel-eyed discipline of a conqueror. This internal transformation is as significant as any battle. The prince is no longer a boy playing at life. He is a king in waiting, preparing to reclaim ancestral lands in France through sheer force of will and pious conviction. Prince Henry VI, the son of the great conqueror, represents a tragic divergence in the royal line. Unlike his father, he finds no joy in the clatter of steel or the strategy of war. We see him in a vast, cold scriptorium, surrounded by vellum scrolls and blueprints for Eton College. He is a prince of the mind and spirit, ill-equipped for the brutal realities of the 15th century. His quiet devotion and lack of martial spirit create a power vacuum that ambitious nobles are eager to fill. The crown sits heavily on a head more suited for a cowl than a helmet. The War of the Roses reaches a fever pitch with Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian Prince of Wales. He is a prince of the March, raised in exile and forged in the bitter rivalry between the red and white roses. He is shown in a windswept camp, poring over maps by candlelight as the rain lashes against the canvas. This is the prince as a fugitive and a fighter, his legitimacy constantly questioned by the Yorkist faction. His story is one of desperate survival, representing the fracturing of the English royal identity into warring, blood-soaked branches of the same family. The most enduring mystery of the royal line centers on the young Edward V and his brother Richard. Confined within the thick limestone walls of the Tower of London, the boy king watches the Thames through a narrow slit window. The presence of their uncle, Richard III, is felt only as a shadow stretching across the floor. This scene depicts the transition from sovereignty to prisoner. The opulence of their royal robes contrasts sharply with the cold, damp stone of their confinement. It is the moment the crown becomes a gilded cage, leading to their eventual silent disappearance from history. With the rise of the Tudors, Prince Arthur is groomed as the new Arthur, a beacon of hope to unite the warring houses. At Ludlow Castle, on the Welsh marches, he studies the arts of statecraft alongside his Spanish bride, Catherine of Aragon. They are seen walking through a cold, mist-covered garden, two teenagers carrying the weight of a new dynasty. Arthur is frail, his physical weakness a hidden flaw in the Tudor facade. This scene illustrates the fragility of dynastic planning, where the health of a single prince can redirect the entire course of a nation's religious and political future. Following his brother's death, the young Henry VIII steps into the light. At this stage, he is the quintessential Renaissance prince, athletic, musical, and intellectually ravenous. He is shown in a grand tilting yard, his horse rearing as he prepares for a tournament. This Henry is vibrant and full of promise, a contrast to the aging, paranoid king he would become. He represents the prince as a celebrity, a man whose physical presence and charisma command the room. The scene is filled with the energy of a new age, where the prince is the center of a dazzling, cultured court. The young Edward VI, the long-awaited male heir, is a prince defined by his intellect and radical religious zeal. In a quiet study, the frail boy king signs decrees that dismantle centuries of Catholic tradition. He is surrounded by stern Protestant advisors, but his own eyes reflect a sharp, uncompromising clarity. This is the prince as a revolutionary, using the power of the pen to reshape the soul of England. His short reign is a whirlwind of change, proving that even a child prince can wield the crown as a weapon of total social and religious transformation. Our second millennium of princes concludes with Henry Frederick, the eldest son of James I. A brilliant polymath and patron of the arts, he stands in his private gallery, examining a collection of globes and scientific instruments. He represents the lost king of the House of Stuart, a prince who bridged the gap between the medieval past and the scientific future. His sudden death from typhoid would leave the throne to his ill-fated brother, Charles I. His scene is one of lost potential, a glimpse of an enlightened monarchy that might have avoided the coming civil wars. With the death of his elder brother, the shy and stuttering Charles I is thrust into the role of heir apparent. He is shown within the somber, echoing halls of Whitehall, dwarfed by massive tapestries that depict the divine right of kings. Unlike his athletic brother, Charles is contemplative and fragile, his face etched with the weight of an office he never expected to hold. This is the prince as a divine vessel, being prepared for a reign that would eventually collide with the iron will of Parliament. The atmosphere is one of heavy, sanctified duty, where every step toward the throne feels like a step toward a tragic destiny. The English Civil War shatters the royal line, turning the young Prince Charles II into a desperate fugitive. We see him hidden within the dense, tangled branches of the Boscobel oak, his royal finery replaced by the rugged, mud-stained clothes of a woodsman. Below, Cromwell's Roundhead soldiers prowl through the mist, their steel helmets glinting in the low light. This is the prince as a survivor, stripped of his titles and hunted across his own kingdom. The scene captures the raw, earthly reality of a monarchy in exile, where survival depends not on lineage, but on the shadows of the forest. Following the Glorious Revolution, the infant Prince James Francis Edward Stuart is spirited away in the dead of night. Known later as the Old Pretender, he is shown as a bundle of lace being carried onto a small, rocking skiff on the dark waters of the Thames. Rain lashes against the secret party as they flee toward France, leaving behind a throne occupied by his sister and her Dutch husband. This is the prince as a political ghost, the king over the water, whose existence would fuel Jacobite rebellions for decades. The scene is one of cold, wet desperation and the loss of a homeland. The arrival of the House of Hanover brings Prince George Augustus to the damp shores of England. Standing on the deck of a massive wooden man-of-war, the German-born prince gazes at his new, unfamiliar kingdom with a mixture of pride and alienation. He speaks little English, and his customs are foreign to the courtiers waiting on the dock. This is the prince as a stranger in a strange land, representing the shift from the charismatic Stuarts to the pragmatic, stoic Hanoverians. The air is thick with sea spray and the smell of wet timber, marking a new, more bureaucratic era of royalty. Frederick, Prince of Wales, represents the tragic archetype of the prince who never became king. In a rare moment of leisure, he is seen on a manicured garden lawn, participating in a game of cricket, the sport that would ultimately lead to his untimely death. He is estranged from his father, George II, and has built a rival court filled with artists and thinkers. This is the prince as a social reformer and patron, a man who sought to modernize the image of the monarchy before his life was cut short by a freak accident. The lighting is golden but fading, signaling an afternoon that will never see the dawn of his reign. The young George III is raised in a gilded cage of intense study and isolation. Guided by the stern Lord Bute, the prince sits in a massive circular library, surrounded by towers of books on agriculture, science, and governance. He is a diligent, serious youth, far removed from the debauchery of his predecessors. This is the prince as an intellectual architect, being molded to be the first truly British king of his line. The scene is quiet and scholarly, yet the weight of the coming American Revolution and his own mental struggles hangs invisibly in the cool, still air of the library. The Prince Regent, the future George IV, personifies the height of royal decadence and the fracture of the monarchy's public image. In the opulent, gold-leafed rooms of Carlton House, he is surrounded by silk drapes, empty wine decanters, and the finery of the dandy era. While his father descends into madness, the Prinny indulges in architectural fantasies and lavish parties. This is the prince as a consumer of luxury, a man whose physical and financial excess creates a deep divide between the crown and the suffering working class during the Industrial Revolution. The scene is suffocatingly rich, filled with the gleam of polished gold and heavy velvet. The narrative shifts to Prince Albert, the prince consort, who redefined the role of a royal through industry and innovation. He is depicted amidst the soaring iron arches and glass panes of the Crystal Palace during the Great Exhibition. Albert is not a prince of the sword, but a prince of the machine age, meticulously checking the placement of a steam engine. He represents the union of the monarchy with the burgeoning power of the British Empire's industrial might. The scene is one of progress and cold iron, a sharp contrast to the soft luxury of previous centuries, highlighting the prince as a modern visionary. The future Edward VII, known as Bertie, spent decades as the prince-in-waiting, living in the long shadow of Queen Victoria. We see him in a dimly lit, smoke-filled private club, surrounded by the socialites and power brokers of the late Victorian era. He is the rebel prince, finding his identity in the worlds of horse racing, theater, and international diplomacy that his mother detested. This is the prince as a cosmopolitan diplomat, bridging the gap between the rigid morality of the 19th century and the Edwardian era of transition. He sits in a leather chair, his face partially obscured by the haze of a cigar, waiting for his time to begin. As the 20th century dawns, Prince Edward, the future Edward VIII, represents the first truly modern celebrity prince. He is shown not in a palace, but in a muddy trench on the Western Front during World War I, wearing a mud-flecked military uniform and talking to weary soldiers. This is the prince as a global icon, whose charisma masks a growing disillusionment with the constraints of his royal duties. The scene captures the transition from the old world of kings to the brutal reality of the modern age, where the prince must navigate a world of cameras, conflict, and the looming possibility of a life outside the crown. The abdication of 1936 shatters the continuity of the crown. Edward VIII, having chosen love over the throne, reverts to the status of a prince in exile. We find him on a rain-slicked dock at Portsmouth, a lonely figure in a heavy wool overcoat clutching a leather suitcase. The weight of his discarded sovereignty hangs in the cold December air. Behind him, the silhouette of a destroyer waits to carry him into the fog of the English Channel. This is the prince as a ghost of the establishment, leaving behind a kingdom he was born to rule but chose to abandon. The burden of the heir falls unexpectedly upon the shy, stuttering Prince Albert, now George VI. During the height of the London Blitz, we see the prince-turned-king standing amidst the jagged ruins of his own home, Buckingham Palace. He wears a naval uniform, his face etched with the exhaustion of a nation under siege. Dust from fallen masonry settles on his shoulders like gray snow. He represents the prince as a symbol of endurance, standing where the bombs have fallen to prove that the monarchy will not flee the fire of the mid-20th century. The narrative evolves with Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, a prince of a different line who becomes the modern consort. In the vestry of Westminster Abbey during the 1953 coronation, he is depicted adjusting his heavy ceremonial robes. He is the bridge between the old naval traditions of the Mediterranean and the cold realities of a post-war British Empire. His expression is one of steel and duty, a prince who must reinvent himself to support a young queen. The air is thick with the scent of incense and the weight of 1,000 years of ritual. In 1969, the investiture of Prince Charles at Caernarfon Castle marks a collision between medieval pageantry and the television age. The young prince kneels on a stone dais, the golden coronet of the Prince of Wales lowered onto his head. Around him, the ancient grey walls of the Welsh fortress are bristling with microphones and television cameras, a jarring contrast of technology and tradition. This is the prince as a public spectacle, caught in the tension between his personal identity and the rigid ceremonial expectations of a nation in the midst of social revolution. The 1980s bring the prince back to the front lines. Prince Andrew, serving as a Sea King helicopter pilot during the Falklands War, represents the return of the warrior prince. We see him on the wind-swept, salt-sprayed deck of HMS Invincible, his flight suit damp with Atlantic spray. He is not a figure of the court, but a soldier of the sea, his face obscured by a flight helmet as he prepares for a mission into the freezing mist. This scene captures the grit of the late 20th century monarchy, attempting to maintain its relevance through direct military service in a distant conflict. As the 1990s dawn, the prince's life becomes a fishbowl. Prince William, a student at Eton College, is seen walking through the historic cloisters, his black tailcoat a reminder of centuries of elitism. However, the shadows here are cast not by stone, but by the relentless gaze of the paparazzi. He is the prince as a captive of fame, shielded by the ancient red brick walls of the school, yet haunted by the flashing bulbs that wait outside the gates. This is a moment of quiet isolation, where the weight of his future crown feels like a physical burden on his young shoulders. In the arid heat of Helmand Province, Prince Harry redefines the spare as a combat soldier. Far from the palaces, he is depicted in a dusty, makeshift bunker, hunched over a radio set with the grime of the Afghan desert on his face. This is the prince stripped of his title, known only by a call sign. The golden light of the desert sun filters through camouflage netting, casting a dappled shadow across his desert fatigues. He represents the modern prince finding a sense of belonging in the Brotherhood of Arms, a stark departure from the gilded halls of his ancestors. The dawn of the 21st century transforms the prince into a global statesman. Prince William is seen in a sleek, modern boardroom in London, surrounded by digital screens displaying environmental data and global maps. He has traded the sword for the power of influence, focusing on conservation and the survival of the planet. The scene is one of clinical precision: glass, steel, and cold blue light. It represents the monarchy's attempt to find a new moral purpose in a secular technological world, where the prince must lead not through command, but through advocacy and soft power. The narrative takes a sharp turn with the fracture of the royal brotherhood. A symbolic scene depicts the departure of a prince from the traditional framework. At a private airfield at night, a figure walks toward the stairs of a small jet, leaving behind the silhouette of the palace in the distance. The wind whips his jacket as he steps away from the security of the royal guard. This is the fall, not through failure, but through a conscious exit from the institution. It is a moment of profound uncertainty, marking the first time in a millennium that a prince has sought a life entirely independent of the crown's shadow. The cycle returns to its beginning with the young Prince George, the future king of a postmodern age. He is seen on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, looking out at a sea of digital screens and waving hands. He is a small child, held by the hand, yet the ancient stone of the balustrade looms large before him. He represents the survival of the line into an unknown future, a prince who will inherit a monarchy that has been stripped of its empire, but remains as a symbol of continuity. The scene is one of immense scale, contrasting the smallness of the heir with the vastness of his heritage. While the Norman conquest reshaped the throne, the story of Edgar Atheling reveals the prince as a ghost of a fallen era. The last male of the House of Wessex, Edgar was proclaimed king, but never crowned, living his life as a perpetual claimant in the shadow of William the Conqueror. His existence was a haunting reminder of the Anglo-Saxon past, a prince whose title became a burden rather than a promise. Forced into a life of nomadic diplomacy and failed rebellions, Edgar represents the prince of the dispossessed, a royal without a realm who survived through sheer obscurity. In the 14th century, the education of a prince became a rigid, intellectual siege. We see a young heir sequestered in a stone scriptorium, surrounded by the speculum principum, mirrors for princes. These texts were designed to forge his soul as much as his mind, teaching him the crushing weight of justice, mercy, and divine right. The prince is no longer just a warrior in waiting. He is a scholar of statecraft. Under the flickering light of tallow candles, he navigates the complex Latin of philosophers, preparing for a throne that demands he be both a lion of the battlefield and a fox of the council chamber. The prince's life was often used as the ultimate political currency. During the Barons' War, the future Edward I was held as a high-stakes hostage by Simon de Montfort. This scene captures the prince not in a palace, but in a gilded prison, a castle room where he is treated with royal deference but cannot leave. It is here that the prince learns the bitter lesson of betrayal and the fragility of the crown's authority. His captivity becomes his true classroom, where he observes the mechanics of rebellion from the inside, hardening his resolve to one day crush those who dared to cage him. As the line of succession grew crowded, the spare princes were often diverted into the iron embrace of the church. These royal sons traded their swords for croziers, becoming powerful prince-bishops who commanded both spiritual and temporal realms. We see a younger prince being tonsured in a cold cathedral, his royal silks replaced by the somber wool of the clergy. Though he will never wear the crown of England, he will wield the wealth of the church to bankroll his brother's wars, proving that the influence of a prince extends far beyond the bloodline and into the very architecture of faith and finance. The physical identity of the prince was forged in the specific heraldry of the Prince of Wales. This scene focuses on the 1343 investiture of the Black Prince, where the iconic 3 ostrich feathers and the motto Ich dien, I serve, were first cemented into royal lore. The prince is surrounded by the heavy symbols of his station, the golden circlet, the ring, and the silver rod. This ritual transformed the man into a living monument, a heraldic symbol that the people could recognize on the horizon. It was a branding of the soul, tying the heir's personal honor to the ancient landscape of the Welsh marches. In the volatile climate of the late 15th century, the role of the prince was often defined by the fear of his own kin. Edward of Middleham, the only son of Richard III, represents the fragile hope of a dynasty built on blood and usurpation. We see him in the rugged, cold climate of Middleham Castle in the north, far from the intrigues of London. He is a frail child, burdened by the immense expectations of a father who has fought his way to the top. His sudden death would shatter the Yorkist cause, proving that the survival of the prince is the only true anchor for a king's legacy. The Renaissance transformed the prince into a pinnacle of physical and intellectual prowess. Before he was the tyrant of history, the young Henry VIII was the Rose of England, a prince who excelled in the tilt-yard and the music room. This scene captures the vibrant energy of a prince who redefined the royal image through athleticism. We see him breathless after a joust, his armor gleaming, surrounded by the elite of his court. He represents the prince as a celebrity, an idol of the people whose charisma was as much a tool of statecraft as his father's gold, signaling a shift toward the cult of personality. The tragedy of the prince often played out in the bitterness of exile. James Francis Edward Stuart, known as the Old Pretender, spent his childhood in the French court of Saint-Germain, a prince with a title but no country. This scene depicts the surreal life of a shadow court, where the boy is treated as a king in waiting, yet he is merely a pawn in the global chess match between France and England. He is surrounded by aging Jacobite loyalists, living in a world of what if, his royal identity preserved in a vacuum of longing and failed conspiracies across the English Channel. By the mid-19th century, the role of the prince shifted from the battlefield to the laboratory. Prince Albert, as the prince consort, became the architect of the Great Exhibition, pushing the monarchy to embrace the steam-driven future. This scene shows the prince over blueprints and iron gears, his hands moving not toward a sword, but toward the schematics of the Crystal Palace. He reimagined the prince as a visionary of progress, a bridge between the ancient aristocracy and the rising industrial class. His influence was silent but absolute, proving that a prince could conquer the world through innovation rather than conquest. The final evolution of the traditional prince saw him as a cadet of the global empire. In the late Victorian and Edwardian eras, it became mandatory for princes to serve in the Royal Navy, the sovereign of the seas. We see a young prince on the deck of a steel-clad battleship, enduring the same spray and discipline as any other officer. This wasn't just training. It was a symbolic bonding of the crown to the naval power that held the empire together. The prince became a sailor, a face of the monarchy that was visible in every port from Gibraltar to Hong Kong, tethering the throne to the horizon. Before the rigid laws of primogeniture took root, the fate of the prince was decided by the Waitan, a council of powerful nobles and bishops. In this scene, we witness a young etheling standing before a circle of stern, furs-clad elders in a candlelit timber hall. The choice of a successor is an elective gamble based on merit, strength, and bloodline rather than birth order alone. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax and old vellum as the boy is scrutinized like a weapon of war. His future is not a gift, but a consensus, highlighting the precarious nature of royal identity in the Anglo-Saxon twilight. In the brutal landscape of the 12th century border wars, a prince's life was often used as a human collateral. This scene depicts a young prince being handed over as a noble hostage at a lonely, wind-swept fortress on the Scottish marches. He is not a prisoner of the dungeon, but a guest of the high table, living in the court of his father's enemies to ensure a fragile peace. The visual focus is on the heavy iron keys and the exchange of signed treaties, where the boy is a living signature. His royalty is both his protection and his cage, a pawn in the high-stakes game of territorial survival. The mid-14th century brought an invisible enemy that didn't care for royal blood, the Black Death. This scene captures the eerie isolation of a prince and his household as they flee the pestilence-ridden capital for a remote rural manor. We see the prince looking through a leaded glass window at a landscape of abandoned fields and distant, black-flagged villages. The royal court, usually bustling with petitioners, is reduced to a handful of fearful attendants. This moment represents the prince's first encounter with the fragility of his own divinity, realizing that his crown offers no sanctuary against the microscopic reaper stalking his kingdom. With the arrival of William Caxton's printing press in the late 15th century, the prince's image moved from the oral tradition to the permanent page. We see a young prince observing the mechanical marvel of the press, his hands stained with ink as he holds the first printed manual of kingship. This technological shift meant that the prince's virtues and flaws could now be disseminated to a literate public, ending the era of the mystical royal and beginning the era of the public figure. The scene emphasizes the transition from the sword to the type block as the primary tool of royal influence. Not every prince was destined for the throne. Many were funneled into the iron discipline of the medieval church to secure the family's spiritual and political power. Here, a younger prince is shown receiving the tonsure, his royal silks replaced by the austere wool of a novice. The scene takes place in a cold, echoing cathedral, where the boy is being groomed to become a prince bishop. This path was a different kind of conquest, one of souls, tithes, and ecclesiastical law. His crown is now a mitre, and his scepter a crozier, representing the strategic depth of the royal line's reach into the afterlife. During the long, heirless reign of Elizabeth I, the concept of the prince became a ghost, a source of intense national anxiety. This scene depicts the shadow prince, the hypothetical successor, as a subject of whispered conspiracies in dark corridors. We see the aging queen's counselors, like Walsingham, poring over maps and genealogical charts of distant cousins. The prince in this era is not a person, but a vacuum of power, a terrifying uncertainty that led to the rise of the Secret Service. The visual focus is on the hidden daggers and coded letters that defined the search for a royal future. In 1666, the role of the prince returned to the streets during the Great Fire of London. James, Duke of York, the king's brother, is seen leading the bucket chains and directing the demolition of houses to create fire breaks. This is the prince as a first responder, his face blackened by soot, his royal finery ruined by the heat. Moving away from the detached majesty of the palace, he earns his legitimacy through physical toil and public bravery. The scene captures the moment the prince became a visible protector of the city, standing between the populace and the total destruction of their world. The reach of the British prince extended across the Atlantic, even in the midst of rebellion. In 1781, Prince William Henry, the first member of the royal family to visit America, is seen in the Loyalist stronghold of New York. The scene depicts him as a young midshipman, walking through the snowy, fortified streets, a symbol of the king's presence in a crumbling colony. He is a royal face in a revolutionary landscape, a reminder of the global scale of the crown's ambitions. The cold, blue light of a New York winter emphasizes his isolation from the warmth of London, a prince at the edge of an empire in flux. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 turned the prince's heart into a matter of state security. This scene shows a prince standing in a cold, marble-floored hall, reading the legal document that forbids him from marrying for love without the king's consent. This is the prince as a prisoner of his own bloodline, where personal happiness is sacrificed for the purity of the succession. The visual focuses on the weight of the law, the heavy stacks of legal volumes, and the cold, unyielding architecture of the palace. It is the moment the prince realizes that his most private choices belong to the parliament and the crown. By the late 18th century, the Grand Tour became the final rite of passage for the prince, a journey of cultural conquest across Europe. This scene shows a prince among the ruins of Rome, sketching ancient columns under the watchful eye of a tutor. This was the prince as an enlightened scholar, absorbing the art and history of the continent to bring a sense of classical authority back to Britain. It highlights a shift from military training to intellectual refinement, where the prince's power was measured by his taste and his understanding of the world's heritage rather than just his prowess on the battlefield. As the 1830s dawned, the Industrial Revolution forced the prince out of the palace and into the soot-stained heart of northern England. Prince George of Cambridge is seen here witnessing the terrifying power of a blast furnace. The prince is no longer just a figure of courtly grace, but a witness to the raw, mechanical muscle that would redefine the nation's wealth. Amidst the orange glow of molten iron and the rhythmic clanging of heavy hammers, the prince represents the crown's uneasy first encounter with the working class and the machines that would eventually challenge the old feudal order. By the mid-19th century, the education of a prince transitioned from the riding school to the deck of a steam-powered warship. Prince Alfred, the second son of Queen Victoria, is depicted as a midshipman, hauling ropes alongside common sailors. This was the sailor-prince era, where the heir's merit was tested by the harsh discipline of the sea and the unforgiving spray of the Atlantic. The prince becomes a living symbol of the Royal Navy's global supremacy, his character forged in the salt and steel of a burgeoning maritime empire, far from the sheltered luxury of Windsor. The invention of the daguerreotype in the 1840s forever altered the prince's relationship with time. For the first time, a prince had to sit perfectly still for several minutes, his image captured not by a painter's flattering brush, but by the cold, objective eye of the camera. This scene captures a young prince in a stiff collar, surrounded by the bulky wooden apparatus of early photography. It represents the moment the prince's mystique began to give way to public scrutiny. The stillness of the pose highlights the transition from a semi-mythical figure to a documented historical human being. The winter of 1854 brought a prince to the frozen trenches of the Crimea. Prince George, Duke of Cambridge, is shown wrapped in heavy furs, staring out across the desolate, snow-covered landscape of Sevastopol. This was a turning point where the prince witnessed the brutal reality of modern warfare. Not as a distant commander, but as an officer sharing the deprivations of his men. The scene emphasizes the vulnerability of the royal line when faced with the grinding attrition of a winter siege, marking a departure from the glorious, idealized battles of the previous century. In 1875, the Prince of Wales embarked on an epic tour of India, a journey that redefined the prince as an imperial diplomat. The scene depicts him seated atop a magnificently caparisoned elephant, moving through a crowded, sun-drenched bazaar. This was the prince as the face of the British Raj, bridging the gap between the ancient traditions of the East and the formal rigidity of the West. It highlights the prince's role as a unifying figurehead for a vast, multicultural empire, navigating a landscape of complex loyalties and breathtaking scales of architecture and color. With the advent of the Great War, the prince took to the skies, signaling a new and dangerous era of royal service. Prince Albert, the future George VI, is seen in the cramped, oil-streaked cockpit of a biplane. The scene captures the transition of the prince into the Royal Naval Air Service, where the battlefield was no longer on land or sea, but in the thin, freezing air of the clouds. This role required a technical mastery and a solitary bravery that contrasted sharply with the traditional image of the prince leading charges on horseback. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, the Prince of Wales sought a new connection with a suffering populace. He is depicted here deep underground in a Welsh coal mine, his face smeared with dust, listening to the concerns of the miners. This Prince of the People moment was a radical shift in royal optics, where the heir's legitimacy was tied to his empathy for the plight of the working man. The scene captures the tension between his gilded background and the grim, claustrophobic reality of the mines, reflecting a monarchy trying to remain relevant in a time of social upheaval. World War II placed the prince in the heart of the Mediterranean conflict. Prince Philip, serving as a young naval officer, is shown on the bridge of a destroyer during the Battle of Cape Matapan. The scene focuses on the intense focus of the prince as he operates a searchlight, illuminating enemy vessels in the dark of night. This was the prince as a professional warrior, his royal status secondary to his duty as a navigator and gunnery officer. It underscores a century of tradition where princes earned their place through active, high-stakes military service during global crises. In the post-war era, the prince became the primary envoy to a rapidly changing Commonwealth. Prince Philip is seen here in a vast African savanna, meeting with tribal leaders as the old colonial structures began to dissolve. The scene represents the prince's role in managing the transition from empire to a voluntary association of nations. He is a figure of continuity in a world of decolonization, using soft diplomacy and a shared sense of history to maintain the crown's influence in a globe that was no longer colored entirely in British red. As the 20th century drew to a close, the prince's focus shifted toward the survival of the planet itself. Prince Charles is depicted in a quiet, sunlit study, surrounded by architectural blueprints and botanical sketches. This is the prince as a visionary and conservationist, championing sustainable urban planning and organic farming long before they became mainstream concerns. The scene marks the final evolution of the traditional prince into a modern steward of the environment, where the defense of the realm is no longer about borders, but about the preservation of the natural world for future generations. By the late 1970s, the prince's role evolved into a catalyst for social reform in the face of urban decay. We see the Prince of Wales navigating the wreckage of post-industrial inner cities, establishing a trust to empower disenfranchised youth. This was not the prince as a ruler, but as a bridge between the establishment and the marginalized. Amidst the smoke of factory chimneys and the stark concrete of council estates, the prince becomes a figure of social conscience, using his platform to address the structural failures of a changing British economy. The mid-20th century saw the prince's life uniquely tethered to the sea through the HMY Britannia, a floating palace and diplomatic tool. Here the prince is shown on the polished teak deck, surrounded by the vast, lonely blue of the Atlantic. This vessel was more than a ship. It was a mobile fragment of British soil that allowed the prince to project influence to the furthest reaches of the globe. The scene emphasizes the isolation of royal service, where the prince is a sailor diplomat, far removed from the comforts of the capital. As the space age dawned, the prince became the royal conduit to the future of mankind. In 1969, we observed the prince meeting the crew of Apollo 11, a collision between centuries-old tradition and the bleeding edge of technology. The prince, dressed in formal attire, stands before the metallic, futuristic hull of a spacecraft. It is a moment where the ancient line of kings acknowledges the new explorers of the heavens, positioning the monarchy not as a relic of the past, but as a witness to the unfolding mystery of the universe. The education of the modern prince took a grueling turn in the wind-swept hills of Scotland. At Gordonstown, the heir is shown enduring the challenge, a regime of physical hardship designed to break the royal bubble. We see the prince soaked by freezing rain, hauling a heavy timber through the mud. This was a deliberate departure from the gilded tutors of the past, aiming to forge a prince with the grit of a commoner. The scene captures the raw, unforgiving landscape where a future king learns the discipline of the body. History often forgets the princes who served as consorts in the shadows of powerful queens. Prince George of Denmark, husband to Queen Anne, is depicted here in a quiet, candlelit gallery, surrounded by the portraits of a dynasty that struggled to produce an heir. His role was one of quiet support and private tragedy, navigating a court filled with political intrigue while his own influence remained largely ceremonial. The scene captures the melancholy of a prince whose legacy was defined by what he could not provide, a surviving successor. The 1911 investiture of the Prince of Wales at Caernarfon Castle marked a revival of medieval romanticism in the Edwardian era. We see the young prince, future Edward VIII, draped in heavy velvet robes, standing within the gray stone battlements. This was a carefully manufactured spectacle, designed to bolster national identity through the projection of ancient ritual. The scene emphasizes the weight of the crown's expectations on a young man who already felt the constraints of his destiny. His face a mask of solemnity amidst the pomp and pageantry. With the rise of mass media, the prince's private life was forever altered by the camera's lens. In the late 1960s, we witnessed the prince during the first televised royal documentary, sitting before a wall of monitors. This was the moment the prince became a public commodity, his every gesture analyzed by millions. The scene highlights the tension between the ancient need for royal mystique and the modern demand for transparency. The prince is a man caught between two worlds. His image broadcast into the living rooms of a nation that was losing its deference. The tradition of the gap year took the prince to the harsh, sun-baked interior of the Australian outback. Here, the prince is shown working on a remote cattle station, a far cry from the palaces of London. Surrounded by ancient eucalyptus trees and red dust, he is a figure of solitary labor. This experience served to connect the heir with the broader Commonwealth, testing his resilience in an environment that cared nothing for his titles. It represents the prince as a global citizen, earning respect through sweat and anonymity. On Remembrance Sunday, the prince's role as the symbolic head of the armed forces is most visceral. We see the prince standing in total silence at the cenotaph, a wreath of poppies in his hands. The scene is stripped of all royal excess, focusing on the weight of history and the sacrifice of generations. The prince represents the continuity of the state's gratitude, a living link between the fallen of the world wars and the modern military. His posture is one of deep, stoic mourning, a guardian of the nation's collective memory. The cycle of the prince inevitably ends with the accession council. Following the passing of the monarch, the prince is shown in the gilded but somber environment of St. James's Palace, signing the proclamation that ends his time as heir. The scene focuses on the heavy, ink-stained documents and the gravity of the moment. The title of prince is shed, and the burden of sovereignty is assumed. It is the final transformation in the royal journey, where the preparation of a lifetime meets the reality of the throne. In the late 10th century, the Aetheling, the prince of the blood, served as the living embodiment of Saxon law. Before the crown became an absolute inheritance, the prince was the primary enforcer of the Wehrgild, the ancient system of restorative justice. We see a young prince presiding over a village assembly, his hand resting on a heavy iron-bound law book. He is not a conqueror here, but a mediator, translating the king's will into the language of the common people. This judicial role established the prince as the moral anchor of the community, long before the centralization of the royal courts. During the brutal civil wars of the 1150s, the prince often served as a human insurance policy. The young Henry Fitz-Empress is depicted during the siege of Wallingford, standing atop a crenellated wall as a hostage for a fragile truce. Unlike the glory of later battles, this scene captures the vulnerability of the heir, used as a piece on a political chessboard. The air is thick with the smoke of siege engines and the smell of damp earth. It is a moment of cold calculation, where the life of the prince is the only thing preventing a wholesale massacre of the garrison. As the medieval era waned, the prince's identity became inextricably linked to the science of heraldry. In 1484, we observe the Prince of Wales overseeing the formalization of the College of Arms. Surrounded by rolls of vellum and jars of vibrant pigment, the prince directs the recording of the royal lineage. This was the moment the prince became the curator of the nation's history, ensuring that every drop of royal blood was tracked through intricate shields and symbols. It marks a transition from the prince as a warrior to the prince as the architect of dynastic memory. The Renaissance transformed the prince into a masterpiece of diplomatic theater. At the Field of the Cloth of Gold, a young royal heir is depicted not in armor, but in heavy silks and gold thread, acting as a translator between competing courts. The scene is one of overwhelming opulence filtered through a lens of suspicion. Beneath the grand tents, the prince navigates the dangerous undercurrents of European rivalry. His role is to be a visual spectacle, a living advertisement for the wealth and power of his house, proving that the prince's presence was as effective as any standing army. In the 1780s, the prince's horizon expanded to the ends of the earth. Prince William Henry, the future sailor king, is shown on the deck of a naval frigate navigating the ice-choked waters of the North Atlantic. Far from the comforts of London, he endures the same rations and rigors as any midshipman. This scene captures the prince as an explorer, tethering the monarchy to the burgeoning scientific and maritime ambitions of the Enlightenment. It is a portrait of endurance, where the royal title is secondary to the survival of the ship and the charting of unknown territories. The Restoration brought a new breed of prince, the scientist. Prince Rupert of the Rhine is depicted in his private laboratory within the towers of Windsor Castle, illuminated by the glow of a forge. He is perfecting Rupert's drops, toughened glass that defied the science of the day. The prince is shown with soot-stained hands, a radical departure from the pristine royal image. This represents the prince as a pioneer of the royal society, bridging the gap between ancient alchemy and modern physics, proving that the intellect of the heir could be as sharp as his sword. By the early 19th century, the prince began to find his voice as a social advocate. Prince William Frederick, the Duke of Gloucester, is shown in a somber meeting with early abolitionists. In a room filled with maps of the Atlantic trade routes, he signs a petition against the slave trade. This scene marks a pivotal shift in the rise of the prince, the evolution of the royal conscience. No longer just a figure of state, the prince becomes a partisan for human rights, using his proximity to the throne to challenge the very foundations of the empire's economy. The year 1896 saw the prince enter the age of the moving image. The Prince of Wales is depicted at Marlborough House, watching the very first flicker of a cinematograph. The room is dark, save for the beam of the projector cutting through the dust motes. As he watches a grainy version of himself on screen, the prince realizes his privacy has forever vanished. This moment captures the birth of the media prince, where his every gesture can now be captured, looped, and projected to the masses. It is the beginning of the modern royal fishbowl, a technological revolution that reshaped the crown. As the mid-20th century brought the wind of change, the prince became the face of a peaceful transition. We see the prince at an independence ceremony in Africa, standing under a midnight sky as a new national flag is raised. He is handing over the constitutional documents with a stoic, respectful bow. This scene represents the prince as the diplomat of decolonization, the person tasked with gracefully dismantling the empire his ancestors built. It is a moment of profound historical humility, where the prince's role is to ensure that the end of British rule is marked with dignity and order. In the modern era, the prince's battlefield moved into the digital shadows. A contemporary prince is shown visiting a secure intelligence facility, surrounded by glowing screens of code and global data streams. He is engaged in a briefing on cyber warfare, representing the heir's new responsibility in an age of invisible threats. The scene highlights the prince as a guardian of national security in the 21st century, where the defense of the realm no longer requires a horse or a shield, but an understanding of the complex algorithms that protect the modern state. It is the latest evolution in a 1,000-year journey. In the 13th century, the prince's authority was rooted in the cold mathematics of the exchequer. We see a young heir overseeing the trial of the Picts, where newly minted coins are weighed for purity against standard weights. The room is heavy with the scent of beeswax and cold iron. This process was the prince's direct link to the economic stability of the realm, ensuring that the currency bearing his family's image remained untarnished. It illustrates the prince not as a warrior, but as a guardian of the nation's wealth and a master of the complex, emerging bureaucracy of the medieval state. By 1675, the prince's interests turned toward the heavens. Prince James, Duke of York, stands upon the construction site of the Royal Observatory at Greenwich. He is peering through a long brass telescope, his silhouette sharp against a twilight sky. This moment signifies the prince as a patron of the burgeoning Enlightenment, where the mapping of the stars was essential for the navigation of the burgeoning British Empire. His investment in science reflects a shift in royal duty, prioritizing the intellectual conquest of the natural world to secure the kingdom's future dominance upon the high seas. The medieval forest laws created a unique landscape where the prince was the ultimate predator. In the damp, misty depths of the New Forest, we observe a prince leading a royal hunt, his hawk poised upon a leather gauntlet. This was more than sport. It was a ritual of sovereignty and a rehearsal for war. The forest was his private domain, a place where the prince enforced the king's peace through the strict regulation of the wild. The scene captures the raw, primal connection between the royal line and the ancient English landscape, where the hunt served as a display of discipline and power. In the 1760s, the prince's education sought inspiration from the ghosts of antiquity. Prince Edward, Duke of York, is depicted amidst the crumbling marble ruins of the Roman Forum during his grand tour. He holds a sketchbook, capturing the arches of fallen emperors. This scene highlights the prince as a student of history, learning the sobering lesson that even the greatest empires can crumble. His journey through Italy was a rite of passage intended to instill a sense of classical virtue and architectural taste, shaping the aesthetic and philosophical identity of the future Georgian monarchy in the face of ancient ruin. The mid-19th century saw the prince become the architect of industrial triumph. Prince Albert is seen standing beneath the soaring iron and glass vaulted ceiling of the Crystal Palace in 1851. Surrounded by massive steam engines and intricate looms, he represents the prince as the visionary of the Great Exhibition. This was a departure from traditional royal roles, as he championed the fusion of art, industry, and international peace. The scene emphasizes the prince's role in ushering Britain into a new era of technological supremacy, turning the monarchy into a champion of progress and global trade. In a display of the divine right, the prince participated in the mystical ritual of touching for the king's evil. Within a candle-lit chapel, a young prince places his hands upon the necks of the afflicted, who believe his touch can cure scrofula. This scene captures the deeply religious and superstitious role of the royal line, where the prince was seen as a conduit for God's healing power. It represents the height of the monarchical mystique, a time when the physical presence of the prince was considered a literal holy vessel, bridging the gap between the earthly and the divine. By the late 18th century, the prince's duty was forged in the oak and salt of the royal dockyards. Prince William Henry, the future sailor king, is shown at Deptford, observing the construction of a massive ship of the line. He stands amidst a forest of timber ribs, holding a roll of blueprints. This scene illustrates the prince's immersion in the naval culture that defined British power. Unlike his predecessors, his training was professional and practical, signaling a new era where the prince was expected to master the technical skills of the nation's primary defense. The wooden walls of the Navy, the fragility of the royal line, is most poignantly felt in the silence of the royal vault. We see a solemn procession of princes in the dark corridors of St. George's Chapel during a time of national mourning. They carry torches that cast dancing shadows against the stone effigies of their ancestors. This scene represents the weight of lineage and the ever-present shadow of mortality that haunted the succession. It is a moment of quiet reflection on the continuity of the crown, where each prince acknowledges his place in a 1,000-year chain that is both a source of power and a heavy, inescapable burden. In the mid-18th century, the prince became the custodian of the nation's memory. The Prince of Wales is depicted in a private library, surrounded by stacks of ancient manuscripts and rare maps being prepared for the founding of the British Museum. He is examining a medieval chronicle, his face illuminated by a single lamp. This scene captures the prince as an intellectual curator, shifting the royal focus from territorial conquest to the preservation of knowledge. It highlights the crown's role in establishing the cultural foundations of the modern state, where the collection of history was a tool of national identity. The late 20th century brought the prince into the heart of urban decay with a mission of renewal. A modern prince is shown walking through a derelict inner-city housing estate, clutching architectural plans for a new community project. The sky is a bruised purple, and the concrete is etched with the marks of time. This scene represents the prince's evolution into a social reformer, using his platform to address the failures of modern planning and advocate for human-centric design. It marks the prince's transition into a champion for the disenfranchised, attempting to bridge the gap between the palace and the pavement through philanthropy. In 1696, the stability of the realm rested not on swords, but on the purity of its silver. The prince is depicted at the Royal Mint within the Tower of London, overseeing the great recoinage alongside Sir Isaac Newton. Amidst the deafening roar of industrial presses and the heat of melting furnaces, the prince inspects a newly struck shilling, its milled edge designed to thwart clippers. This moment captures the transition of royal power into the realm of high finance and economic security, where the prince becomes the guardian of the nation's currency and the literal face of its fiscal integrity. Following the fall of Napoleon, the Prince Regent played a silent but pivotal role in the Congress of Vienna. The scene unfolds in a grand, candlelit ballroom where the map of Europe is literally being redrawn upon a massive mahogany table. The prince moves among diplomats and emperors, using the soft power of royal hospitality to influence borders and balance the scales of peace. This represents the prince as a master of the ballroom battlefield, where a whispered word or a strategic toast could secure more territory than a cavalry charge, marking the height of royal diplomatic finesse. The mid-19th century introduced the prince to a new form of majesty, the speed of the locomotive. We see the Prince of Wales seated in a luxurious wood-paneled royal carriage, the first of its kind, as it hurtles through the English countryside. Outside the window, the pastoral world is a blur of steam and iron. This scene captures the moment the monarchy embraced the Industrial Revolution's greatest triumph, transforming the prince from a figure of static ritual into a modern traveler. The rhythmic clatter of the tracks signals a future where the prince is no longer distant, but rapidly moving toward his people. In 1851, the prince became the patron of a translucent future. He is seen standing on the iron skeleton of the Crystal Palace during its construction in Hyde Park. Surrounded by a forest of girders and a sea of glass panes, the prince consults with engineers, his figure dwarfed by the sheer scale of the architectural marvel. This represents the prince as the architect of a new global era, championing an internationalist vision where trade and technology supersede traditional warfare. The structure's transparency symbolizes a new, more visible relationship between the crown and the burgeoning achievements of the Victorian age. The prince's role as a global collector reached its zenith with the expansion of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. He is depicted in a humid, tropical glasshouse, surrounded by exotic specimens brought from the furthest reaches of the empire. He examines a rare, flowering vine, a symbol of the crown's desire to categorize and control the natural world. This scene highlights the prince's involvement in the Green Empire, where the collection of flora was a strategic act of colonial science. It reflects a time when royal power was measured by the diversity of the world's life held within the prince's gardens. During the darkest hours of the 1940s, the prince's duties moved into the silent world of cryptography. A young prince is shown visiting a clandestine bunker at Bletchley Park, standing before the whirring rotors of a bomb machine. In the dim, smoke-filled room, he speaks with mathematicians and code breakers who are unraveling the enemy's secrets. This represents the prince's immersion into the secret war, acknowledging that the survival of the throne now depended on data and intelligence rather than traditional bravery. It is a scene of quiet, high-stakes tension, where the prince witnesses the birth of the computer age. In the 13th century, the prince's power was often tempered by the demands of the soul. We see a young heir on a grueling, barefoot pilgrimage to the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury. Clad in simple wool and covered in the dust of the road, he kneels before the flickering candles of the martyr's tomb. This scene portrays the prince not as a ruler, but as a penitent, bound by the same spiritual fears as his subjects. It underscores the medieval reality that the prince was a servant of both the state and the church, seeking divine favor to ensure his future reign. The 19th century Balmoralization of the monarchy created a new, romanticized identity for the prince. He is depicted at the Braemar gathering in the Scottish Highlands, wearing a traditional kilt and surrounded by clan chieftains. The landscape is a misty tapestry of purple heather and gray granite. This scene represents the prince's role in the invention of tradition, successfully integrating Scottish culture into the royal brand to create a unified British identity. It marks a shift from the prince as an English conqueror to the prince as a pan-British symbol, blending the ancient wildness of the North with the dignity of the crown. In the 1920s, the prince's voice conquered the airwaves for the first time. The scene is a quiet, velvet-lined studio where the prince leans toward a massive, primitive microphone. He is delivering a wireless address to the entire empire, his words traveling thousands of miles through the invisible medium of radio. This moment marks the birth of the electronic prince, where the royal presence was no longer limited to sight, but became a constant, intimate sound in the homes of millions. The isolation of the palace is finally breached by the reach of the radio signal, forever changing the royal connection to the public. As the 21st century looks toward biological heritage, the prince takes on the role of a planetary guardian. He is shown inside the frozen vault of a global seed bank, standing amongst shelves of silver canisters containing the genetic blueprints of the world's crops. The air is crystalline with cold, and the blue light of the facility reflects off the ice-coated walls. This scene represents the prince's involvement in deep time conservation, shifting focus from immediate social issues to the long-term survival of human civilization. He is the custodian of a future that may never see him, ensuring that life itself endures beyond the reign of kings. In 1484, Richard III established the College of Arms, transforming the prince's lineage into a formalized legal science. In a chamber filled with the scent of old vellum and drying ink, the prince watches as a king of arms meticulously paints a family tree. This is no longer a matter of oral tradition. It is a bureaucratic anchoring of the bloodline. Every branch and lion is audited, turning the prince into a codified asset of the state. It represents the transition from medieval lordship to a modern, documented aristocracy, where power is defined by the meticulous, indelible stroke of a quill. The Restoration brought a prince fascinated by the secrets of the physical world. Deep in a basement laboratory beneath Whitehall, Prince Rupert of the Rhine experiments with molten glass and heavy metals. Surrounded by retorts and bubbling crucibles, he discovers Prince Rupert's drops, toughened glass that can withstand a hammer blow. This moment marks the prince as a pioneer of experimental science, moving away from the mystical, divine right toward an understanding of empirical truth. The prince is no longer just a ruler of men, but a master of the very elements that comprise his realm. By the turn of the 18th century, the prince's influence extended into the cold ledgers of the East India Company. In a grand, wood-paneled boardroom in London, the prince sits at the head of a massive mahogany table strewn with maps of the spice routes and tea trade. He is the bridge between the crown and the burgeoning corporate power of the British Empire. This scene depicts the prince as a global financier, where his signature on a charter has more power than a sword. The expansion of the realm is now measured in cargo and dividends, not territory. During the Crimean War, the prince's role evolved into that of a humanitarian coordinator. In a dimly lit, high-ceilinged warehouse near the London docks, the prince oversees the packing of supplies for Florence Nightingale's hospitals in Scutari. He isn't leading a cavalry charge, but managing the flow of blankets, medicine, and clean water. This represents the birth of the modern working royal, where the prince's prestige is used to bridge the gap between military bureaucracy and civilian charity. His contribution is measured in lives saved through organization rather than glory won through combat, signaling a new, compassionate duty. As the heroic age of Antarctic exploration began, the prince became the ultimate patron of the unknown. He is depicted on the deck of the Terra Nova, draped in heavy wool and fur, bidding farewell to the explorers heading into the frozen void. The prince represents the nation's appetite for discovery and the ultimate limit of British reach. This scene highlights the prince as a symbol of endurance and national pride in the face of the planet's harshest extremes, linking the crown to the scientific conquest of the last unmapped frontiers on Earth, far from the comfort of the palace. In the shadow of the 100 Years' War, Edward III founded the Order of the Garter. binding the prince to his most loyal knights through a sacred, exclusive brotherhood. In the vaulted stalls of St. George's Chapel, the prince kneels, the blue velvet mantle heavy on his shoulders. This was not just a ceremony, but a strategic tightening of the royal circle against internal dissent. The prince is the first among equals, the center of a military and moral elite. It marks the formalization of the knight prince, where loyalty to the heir is enshrined in religious and courtly ritual. Travel in the 18th century remained a perilous necessity for the prince. We see the prince's carriage halted on a moonlit heath, the wheels mired in mud. Guards with muskets stand alert as a lone highwayman's shadow looms in the distance. This scene emphasizes the prince's vulnerability despite his status, highlighting the lawlessness of the roads he was expected to govern. It represents a time when the royal person was physically at risk from the very subjects he would one day rule, forcing the prince to confront the raw, unpolished reality of his kingdom beyond the secure palace gates. With the rise of photography, the prince became an early adopter of the technology that would eventually consume his privacy. In a red-lit darkroom, the prince watches as a chemical bath reveals an image on a glass plate. He is not just the subject, but the practitioner, fascinated by the alchemy of light and silver. This represents the prince capturing his own world, attempting to control the narrative of his image before the paparazzi era. It is the first time a royal can see themselves as the world sees them, a moment of profound psychological transition into the age of transparency. In the smoky, chaotic atmosphere of a London coffeehouse, a young prince sits in disguise, listening to the murmurs of merchants, poets, and radicals. This was the era of the penny university, where information moved faster than the crown could censor it. By entering this space, the prince acknowledges that power is no longer just in the court, but in public opinion. He is a spy in his own capital, gathering the intelligence necessary to navigate the shifting political tides of the Restoration. This scene marks the prince's realization that a king must understand the common chatter to survive. In the modern era, the prince's influence extends into the ethical governance of artificial intelligence. He is shown in a sleek, darkened data center, surrounded by the humming towers of servers and the glow of cooling fans. He is consulting with developers on the moral implications of autonomous systems. This represents the prince as a bridge between ancient ethics and futuristic technology. No longer a leader of armies, he is now a guardian of human agency in a world increasingly governed by code, ensuring that the human touch of the monarchy remains relevant in a digital century. In the 14th century, the prince's duty extended to the very soil of the kingdom. In the waterlogged marshes of the fens, a young heir oversees the ambitious drainage projects intended to reclaim land from the relentless North Sea. Surrounded by Flemish engineers and mud-stained laborers, the prince studies hand-drawn topographical maps. This is the prince as the great improver, transforming treacherous bogs into fertile breadbaskets for a growing nation. His presence in this desolate, misty landscape signifies the monarchy's commitment to internal expansion and the mastery of the English terrain through sheer engineering will. During the mid-17th century, the prince's role became one of grim administrative oversight during the Great Plague. We see the Duke of York stationed at a heavy iron gate on the city's perimeter, reviewing the health certificates of those seeking entry. The air is thick with the scent of vinegar and burning herbs, intended to ward off miasma. His calm, stoic presence provides a rare anchor of order amidst a city paralyzed by fear. By managing the quarantine, the prince shifts from a figure of courtly leisure to a frontline guardian of public health, enforcing the laws of isolation. In the mid-18th century, the prince became the ultimate arbiter of human ingenuity. Within the hushed, candlelit halls of the Royal Society of Arts, the prince examines a miniature prototype of a new weaving machine. He is not merely a patron, but an examiner of patents, recognizing that the nation's future power lies in mechanical efficiency rather than just territorial conquest. This scene captures the transition of the royal role into the industrial age, where the prince's signature on a patent could ignite a revolution in manufacturing, forever altering the British economy and the global trade landscape. By the 1830s, the prince's focus turned toward the safety of the treacherous coastline. He is depicted at the headquarters of Trinity House, surrounded by massive Fresnel lenses and detailed nautical charts. The prince is instrumental in the systematic construction of lighthouses across the British Isles, ensuring that the wealth of the empire doesn't perish on the rocks. This represents the prince as a protector of the seas through technology and infrastructure. His fascination with the science of optics and navigation reflects a monarchy dedicated to the literal enlightenment of its dangerous, fog-bound maritime borders. In the early 17th century, the prince's influence helped shape the very language of the realm. He is seen in a quiet scriptorium, working alongside a committee of scholars on the translation of the King James Bible. The prince's role is to ensure the linguistic majesty of the text, unifying a fractured religious landscape through a singular, poetic voice. This intellectual endeavor marks a shift where the prince's power is wielded through the pen and the word, creating a cultural cornerstone that would endure for centuries and define the British identity across the burgeoning colonies. During the medieval era, the prince acted as the final word on the honesty of the market. In a bustling but dimly lit provincial square, the prince supervises the calibration of standard weights and measures. He holds a silver-tipped yardstick, comparing it against the local merchant's tools to prevent fraud. This scene emphasizes the prince as the guarantor of fair trade and economic justice. By standardizing the physical units of the kingdom, the prince creates the stability necessary for a national economy to emerge from the chaos of localized feudal bartering systems. The mid-19th century saw the prince revolutionizing the speed of human connection. He is shown in a bustling sorting office, observing the first implementation of the uniform penny post. He holds a sheet of penny black stamps, recognizing that affordable communication is the true glue of a modern empire. This shift depicts the prince as a facilitator of the democratic flow of information. No longer is the post the exclusive privilege of the elite. The prince's patronage of the postal system democratizes the written word, allowing the common citizen to communicate across the length of the country. Deep within the thick stone walls of the Tower of London, the prince manages the Royal Menagerie, a collection of exotic beasts sent as diplomatic gifts. He stands before a shadowed cage containing a lion from the Barbary coast, symbolizing the reach of British influence into distant lands. This is the prince as a custodian of the world's wonders, where nature itself is used as a tool of royal prestige. The menagerie represents the prince's role in early scientific curiosity and the display of global dominance through the possession of the rare and the dangerous. In the 1970s, the prince's role as a global envoy took to the edge of space. He is seen in the cockpit of a Concorde, the needle-nosed supersonic jet that symbolized the pinnacle of British-French engineering. This is the prince as a modern pioneer, embracing the speed that shrank the world and redefined royal diplomacy. By championing this technological marvel, the prince signals the monarchy's departure from the slow pace of the past into a high-velocity future. The scene captures the transition from the golden age of steam to the sleek white titanium reality of the late 20th century. As the 21st century faces the threat of ecological collapse, the prince moves his focus to the preservation of life's genetic blueprint. He is depicted at the entrance of a high-security seed vault, a modern fortress carved into the permafrost. Here, he acts as a guardian of biodiversity, ensuring that the botanical heritage of the kingdom and the world survives any future catastrophe. This final evolution sees the prince as a planetary steward, moving beyond the governance of people to the governance of the very seeds of survival, securing the legacy of the natural world for the next millennium. In the mid-17th century, the prince's duty expanded to the charting of unknown coastlines. Prince Rupert of the Rhine is seen hunched over a vellum map of the Hudson Bay, his fingers tracing the jagged edges of a frozen continent. This is the prince as a pioneer of the fur trade, turning royal ambition into the commerce of survival. His role shifts from a warrior of the Civil War to a visionary of the New World, where the ink of the cartographer is as powerful as the sword. He secures the claim of the crown through the meticulous recording of cold, distant latitudes. By the late 12th century, the prince began to oversee the transition from mystical judgment to structured law. In a cold stone courtyard, the prince observes a trial by ordeal, where the accused must pluck a stone from boiling water. Yet, the prince's expression is one of skepticism, marking the slow rise of the jury system. He represents the crown's growing desire for evidence over divine intervention. This shift marks a pivotal moment where the prince becomes the architect of a more rational justice system, moving the kingdom away from the superstitions of the Dark Ages toward the common law of the future. In 1753, the prince's role as a collector of human history takes a formal shape with the founding of the British Museum. He is depicted in a sprawling library, surrounded by Egyptian fragments and Greek marbles that arrived on the shores of the Thames. This is the prince as the curator of the world's memory, turning private royal curiosity into a public institution of enlightenment. By supporting the acquisition of the Sloane Collection, the prince ensures that the treasures of antiquity are preserved for the education of the masses. The scene captures the transition from royal hoarding to the democratization of knowledge. In the early 14th century, the prince redefined the English military machine by championing the longbow. At a muddy training ground, he watches as commoners draw the massive yew bows, their arrows casting long shadows over the earth. The prince realizes that the future of the crown rests not with the armored knight, but with the discipline of the yeoman archer. This strategic pivot democratizes the battlefield and prepares the realm for the grueling wars in France. The prince stands as the bridge between chivalric tradition and the cold, efficient reality of tactical warfare, prioritizing substance over pageantry. By the mid-19th century, the prince's influence reached the highest peaks of the Himalayas. He acts as the patron of the Great Trigonometrical Survey, a massive scientific endeavor to measure the Indian subcontinent with mathematical precision. We see him examining a complex theodolite, a device of brass and glass that represents the triumph of reason over geography. This is the prince as a surveyor of the empire, defining the boundaries of the world through the lens of science. His support of this monumental task cements the British role as the primary observers and mappers of the physical world. During the 1530s, the prince was tasked with a grim but necessary duty: the inventory of the monasteries. In the ruined cloisters of a suppressed abbey, he oversees the collection of ancient manuscripts and silver chalices. This is the prince as the administrative hand of the Reformation, breaking the power of the old church to fund the rise of the modern state. He walks through the dust of history, choosing which relics to save for the royal library and which to melt down for the treasury. The scene represents the prince as the architect of a new, secular national identity. In 1948, the prince's role as the head of a changing family was reflected in the arrival of the Empire Windrush at Tilbury Docks. He stands on the pier, a symbolic figure welcoming the first wave of Caribbean migrants who answered the call to rebuild a war-torn Britain. This is the prince as a bridge builder, acknowledging the shift from a colonial empire to a multicultural commonwealth. His presence signals a quiet acceptance of a new British identity, one forged from the diverse talents of the global subjects. The prince becomes a stabilizing force in an era of rapid social transformation and migration. In the late 15th century, the prince's duty moved from the garrison to the Great Hall as the master of the revels. He is seen directing a complex masque, where courtiers move in elaborate costumes of silk and gold. This is the prince as the choreographer of royal power, using theater and spectacle to maintain the loyalty of the nobility. By turning the court into a stage, he ensures that the internal rivalries of the realm are channeled into the arts rather than the battlefield. The scene captures the prince using culture as a sophisticated weapon of political stability. In the 1760s, the prince's attention was fixed on the tiny, ticking heart of a marine chronometer. He sits with John Harrison, the humble carpenter-turned-clockmaker, examining the H4 timepiece that would finally solve the problem of longitude at sea. This is the prince as a champion of meritocracy and technical innovation, recognizing that the safety of the British fleet depends on the accuracy of a clock. By supporting the trials of this device, the prince ensures Britain's naval supremacy and the expansion of global trade. He transitions the monarchy's focus from land-based power to the mastery of the oceans. As the third millennium progresses, the prince takes on the role of the guardian of the digital realm. Within a secure underground data center, he oversees the migration of the nation's historical records into indestructible glass storage. This is the prince as a protector of the collective memory against the decay of bit rot and cyber warfare. He ensures that the charters of the past and the data of the present survive into a future where physical paper may be lost. The prince evolves into a digital sovereign, securing the integrity of the kingdom's story for the next 1,000 years. In 1193, while Richard I is held in a German fortress, Prince John oversees the collection of the king's ransom. He is not seen as a savior, but as a predator of the realm's faith. He stands in a cold stone vault, watching silent monks count stacks of silver pennies stripped from the altars of every church in England. This is the prince as an auditor of misery, turning religious devotion into political bullion. Every coin represents a sacrifice from the peasantry to buy back a king John secretly hopes never returns, illustrating a deep fracture in royal loyalty. In 1545, the young Prince Edward visits the Deptford dockyards to witness the birth of a new maritime era. Amidst the sharp smell of tar and fresh timber, he studies the heavy bronze cannons being hoisted onto the Mary Rose. This is the prince as the architect of naval defense, recognizing that England's safety lies no longer in castle walls, but in the wooden walls of the fleet. The prince's presence at the ship's hull signals a permanent shift in the nation's military identity toward maritime dominance, preparing the kingdom for an age of global naval power. In 1606, Prince Henry Frederick, the young hope of the Stuarts, examines the royal charter for the Virginia Company. In his private study, surrounded by celestial globes and early maps of the Chesapeake Bay, he envisions a New England across the Atlantic. This is the prince as the patron of expansion, fueling the ambition of merchants and adventurers through the power of the seal. His support legitimizes the first permanent English settlement in the New World, binding the destiny of the royal line to the colonization of a continent and the birth of an overseas empire. In 1672, James, Duke of York, presides over a meeting of the Royal African Company. In a dimly lit boardroom, he examines the ledgers of a trade monopoly that includes ivory, gold, and the grim reality of human trafficking. This is the prince as a merchant of shadows, where royal investment drives the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. The scene captures the moral gravity and dark complexities of the era, where the prince's search for economic stability and power builds the kingdom's wealth upon a foundation of profound human suffering and global exploitation. In 1720, the Prince of Wales, later George II, watches in silence as the South Sea bubble bursts, devastating the nation's finances. He stands within the chaotic exchange alley, surrounded by distraught investors clutching worthless stock certificates. This is the prince as a witness to the fragility of paper wealth. Having invested heavily himself, he experiences the first modern financial crash, learning that a prince's reputation and the monarchy's survival are now inextricably linked to the economic stability of the merchant class and the volatile, invisible whims of the global market. In 1768, Prince George III signs the foundation instrument of the Royal Academy of Arts. In a grand gallery filled with unfinished canvases, he meets with artists to establish a national school of painting and sculpture. This is the prince as the custodian of aesthetic refinement, believing that a nation's greatness is measured by its cultural output. By elevating the status of the artist to a royal profession, he ensures that the British monarchy is immortalized not just through conquest, but through a unique, sophisticated visual culture that defines the European Enlightenment. In 1863, the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, descends into the smoky depths of the world's first underground railway. Standing on an open-air carriage of the Metropolitan line, he travels through gas-lit tunnels choked with coal soot. This is the prince embracing the subterranean future of the city, legitimizing a revolutionary mode of transport that would redefine urban life. His journey beneath the streets of London marks the moment the monarchy literally goes underground to connect with the industrial pulse and the burgeoning middle-class workforce of the modern metropolis. In 1919, Prince Albert, later George VI, visits a soot-stained steel mill in the industrial north. He is there as the president of the Industrial Welfare Society, looking beyond the machines to the health and safety of the men who man them. This is the prince as a bridge between the classes in the aftermath of the Great War. By championing better working conditions and factory reforms, he seeks to heal a fractured nation, proving that the crown's concern extends from the palace gates to the very heart of the factory floor. In 1951, Prince Philip tours the South Bank during the Festival of Britain, a project designed as a tonic for the nation after years of wartime austerity. Standing before the futuristic skyline, he examines the sleek lines of mid-century modern design and atomic age technology. This is the prince as a champion of post-war recovery and scientific optimism. He encourages the nation to look forward to a future of innovation and progress, rather than back at the ruins of war, redefining the prince's role as the patron of a new, vibrant British identity. In the 2020s, in the clean, sterile environment of a high-tech laboratory, the prince meets with scientists developing global immunization strategies. He reviews the logistics of the cold chain required to deliver life-saving medicine to the furthest corners of the globe. This is the prince as a diplomat of public health, using his international platform to address global inequality and emerging biological threats. He transitions the royal role into one of scientific stewardship and ethical governance, ensuring the health of the global community in an age of interconnected, invisible perils. In 1016, Prince Edmund Ironside meets the Danish king Canute on the secluded island of Alni. After a season of brutal conflict for the English throne, the two weary leaders agree to a partition of the realm. This is the prince as a pragmatic survivor, choosing to share his kingdom rather than see it utterly destroyed. The scene captures the moment of a tense, armored handshake amidst the river mists, marking the temporary coexistence of Saxon and Dane, and the agonizing compromise of a prince whose lineage was slowly being eclipsed by Viking steel. By 1091, the Treaty of Caen illustrates the diminishing power of the dispossessed Prince Edgar Atheling. Caught in the fraternal wars between the sons of the conqueror, Edgar is stripped of his Norman lands and forced into a wandering exile. We see him in a cold, stone hall, watching as William Rufus and Robert Curthose sign away his inheritance. This is the prince as a ghost of a former dynasty, a man with the ultimate claim but no army to enforce it, navigating the treacherous waters of Norman diplomacy, where blood ties are consistently sacrificed for territorial gain. In 1254, the young Prince Edward, the future Longshanks, journeys across the rugged Pyrenees to the court of Castile. At the monastery of Las Huelgas, he is knighted by King Alfonso X before marrying Eleanor of Castile, a union designed to secure the borders of Gascony. This is the prince as a continental diplomat, his identity forged through the international marriage market of the Middle Ages. The scene highlights the clash of English and Spanish aesthetics, showing a tall, gangly youth being initiated into the highest orders of chivalry in a sun-drenched, dust-moated cathedral. By 1362, the Black Prince is elevated to the Prince of Aquitaine, establishing a semi-independent royal court in Bordeaux. Far from the oversight of his father, he rules over a vast French territory, surrounding himself with poets, knights, and the finest vintners of the region. This is the prince as a sovereign in all but name, transforming a military occupation into a cultural renaissance. We see him in a lush, vine-fringed balcony overlooking the Garonne River, balancing the ledger of a state that would eventually prove too expensive to maintain, signaling the overextension of the Plantagenet Empire. In 1494, the 3-year-old Prince Henry, the future Henry VIII, is ceremoniously created Duke of York in a spectacle of Tudor self-assertion. Despite his infancy, he is the centerpiece of a grueling series of tournaments and banquets intended to prove the stability of his father's new dynasty. This is the prince as a living icon, a small child buried under the weight of heavy cloth of gold and dynastic expectation. The scene captures the surreal contrast of a toddler surrounded by the steel-clad knights of the old world, marking the beginning of his lifelong obsession with physical dominance and royal display. The year 1594 brings a rare moment of Stuart triumph at Stirling Castle during the baptism of Prince Henry Frederick. King James VI orchestrates a lavish theatrical ceremony featuring a ship pulled by a lion, designed to impress the ambassadors of Europe. This is the prince as a beacon of Protestant hope, uniting the crowns of Scotland and eventually England in the eyes of the world. We see the infant prince in a cradle of state, the focal point of an intricate dance of Northern Renaissance power, symbolizing a future of intellectual and cultural expansion that would be tragically cut short. In 1623, Prince Charles and the Duke of Buckingham arrive in Madrid in absurd disguises, wearing false beards to woo the Spanish Infanta. This Spanish match was a desperate romantic gamble to avoid war and secure a Catholic alliance. This is the prince as a misguided cavalier, operating outside the bounds of traditional diplomacy. The scene depicts Charles in a dusty Spanish courtyard, his face half hidden by a cloak, realizing the cold reality of Spanish court etiquette. It marks a pivotal fall in his public reputation, as his failure in Madrid sowed the seeds of future conflict with Parliament. Following the sudden death of his father in 1751, the 12-year-old Prince George, the future George III, is thrust into the position of heir apparent. He is isolated from the court of his grandfather, George II, and raised under the strict, almost monastic tutelage of Lord Bute. This is the prince as a captive of his own destiny, his personality shaped by the silence and discipline of Leicester House. We see the young prince in a library filled with maps and globes, a solitary figure preparing for a burden he never expected to carry so soon. His life defined by the duty of a true Briton. By 1891, the royal line is rocked by the scandals surrounding Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence. Known as Eddie, the heir presumptive's life in the shadows of London's underworld creates a crisis for the Victorian establishment. This is the prince as a liability, a symbol of the fragility of the royal reputation in the age of the tabloid press. We see him in a dimly lit gentleman's club, the smoke of cigars veiling his face as he maneuvers through a world of debt and whispers, representing a dark chapter where the prince's private failings threatened the very foundation of the crown's moral authority. In 1945, Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, arrives in Canberra to serve as the first Royal Governor-General of Australia. In the heat of the Pacific Theatre's aftermath, he represents the king's personal presence in a Commonwealth that is beginning to assert its independence. This is the prince as a vice-regal bridge, navigating the transition from empire to a partnership of nations. We see him in a crisp white naval uniform against the red dust of the Australian interior, a stark visual representation of the British prince adapting to a landscape and a political reality far removed from the traditions of Westminster. In the damp autumn of 1153, the struggle for the English crown reaches a desperate stalemate. Prince Eustace, the fiery and aggressive heir of King Stephen, watches in simmering fury as his father negotiates the Treaty of Wallingford. For the first time in the history of the Norman princes, an inheritance is legally bargained away to a rival line, Henry of Anjou. This is the prince as a political casualty, his future dissolved in ink and parchment to end a generation of civil war. Eustace's sudden, mysterious death shortly after marks the final collapse of the House of Blois, clearing the path for the Plantagenet era. The year 1203 finds the young Prince Arthur of Brittany, the nephew and rival of King John, languishing in the cold stone confines of Falaise Castle. He represents the tragic archetype of the prince who is too dangerous to let live. As the sun sets over the Norman landscape, Arthur is confronted by his jailer, Hubert de Burgh. The prince's fate becomes one of the greatest cold cases of the medieval world. He disappears from history, likely murdered at his uncle's command. This scene captures the terrifying vulnerability of a royal claimant whose blood is a curse rather than a blessing. In 1301, Edward I creates a new tradition to pacify a conquered land by naming his son Edward of Caernarfon, the first English Prince of Wales. At the newly built iron ring of castles, the young prince is presented to the Welsh chieftains. He is a symbol of a brutal merger, a prince whose title is intended to bridge the gap between English rule and Welsh identity. This moment defines the role of the heir for centuries to come, turning a military conquest into a ceremonial title. Yet the prince himself remains a stranger in the land he is meant to represent. In 1478, the 4-year-old Prince Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, is the center of a lavish, surreal spectacle. His marriage to the 5-year-old heiress, Anne Mowbray. Held in St. Stephen's Chapel, the ceremony is a chilling display of dynastic greed, merging the boy's royal blood with the vast estates of the Norfolk dukedom. This is the prince as a pawn of the late medieval state, his innocence wrapped in heavy gold brocade. The scene is a haunting precursor to his eventual disappearance in the Tower, a brief moment of gilded ceremony before the darkness of the Wars of the Roses consumes him. By 1648, the English Civil War has turned the royal princes into fugitives. In a daring midnight escape from St. James's Palace, the 15-year-old Prince James, Duke of York, is disguised as a girl to evade his parliamentary captors. He slips through the dark gardens and onto a waiting barge on the Thames. This is the prince as an agent of espionage, forced into a humiliating but necessary charade to survive a revolution. The scene highlights the collapse of royal dignity during the interregnum, where a prince's life depends on his ability to hide his identity in the shadows of London. In the winter of 1688, as the glorious revolution unfolds, Prince George of Denmark finds himself in an impossible position. Married to Princess Anne, he is forced to choose between his father-in-law, James II, and the invading William of Orange. At a rainy roadside inn at Andover, the prince quietly deserts the king's army. Known for his frequent dull exclamation of "Est-il possible?", his defection signals the total loss of loyalty within the royal family. This is the prince as a quiet revolutionary, whose passive resistance helps topple a monarch and reshape the British constitutional landscape forever. The year 1746 brings a grim transformation to the image of the prince. Prince William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, earns the moniker the Butcher following the Battle of Culloden. Far from the courtly elegance of London, the prince is seen on the frozen Scottish moors, overseeing the ruthless pacification of the Jacobite rebels. This is the prince as an enforcer of the state, a figure of terror who prioritizes the security of the Hanoverian line over mercy. The scene represents a harsh shift in the royal role, where the prince becomes the hammer of the government in a fractured kingdom. In 1868, Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, becomes the first member of the royal family to visit Australia. But the tour ends in a shocking brush with death. During a picnic at Clontarf in Sydney, a would-be assassin fires a revolver into the prince's back. Though the wound is not fatal, the event shatters the illusion of royal invulnerability in the colonies. This is the prince as a target of global political unrest, his body becoming a flashpoint for Irish republicanism and colonial anxiety. The scene depicts the moment of chaos, where the dignity of the tour is replaced by the raw reality of survival. The early 20th century hides a lost prince within the walls of Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate. Prince John, the youngest son of George V, is sequestered away from the public eye due to his epilepsy and suspected autism. While his brothers are groomed for leadership and war, John lives a life of isolated simplicity, tending his garden and playing with his toy soldiers. This is the prince as a a figure excluded from the royal narrative to maintain the image of physical perfection demanded by the modern monarchy. His short life remains a poignant footnote in the shadow of the crown. In 1972, the age of the daredevil prince comes to a tragic conclusion with the death of Prince William of Gloucester. A glamorous figure who worked for the Foreign Service and loved air racing, he represents the prince as a modern individual seeking an identity outside the palace walls. We see him in the cockpit of his Piper Comanche just before a race, a symbol of the jet-set era's thrill-seeking royalty. His fatal crash at the Goodyear air race marks a somber end to a life lived at high speed, reminding the public that even in the age of machines, the prince remains a mortal subject to fate. In 1976, Prince Charles pivots from his naval career to address the social unrest of a fractured Britain. Using his severance pay of £7,400, he founds the Prince's Trust to provide opportunities for disadvantaged youth in urban centers. This marks the evolution of the prince into a social entrepreneur, moving beyond ceremonial patronage into the gritty realities of unemployment and inner-city decay. We see him in a modest London council estate, a figure of traditional privilege, engaging with the modern struggle of the working class. This act redefines the prince's duty as a direct catalyst for grassroots social mobility. The year 1987 witnesses a rare fracture between a prince and military tradition. Prince Edward, after months of grueling training, elects to resign his commission from the Royal Marines. This decision sends shockwaves through a monarchy that views military service as a non-negotiable rite of passage. Edward represents the prince as an individual seeking intellectual and creative fulfillment over the rigid expectations of the barracks. The scene captures his departure from the Arbroath base, a moment of profound personal quietude against the backdrop of the iron-willed institution he is leaving behind, signaling a modern shift in royal self-determination. In the height of World War II, 1942, the royal family suffers a mysterious and tragic loss. Prince George, Duke of Kent, becomes the first royal in centuries to die on active service when his short Sunderland flying boat crashes into the Eagle's Rock in Scotland. The mission, officially a morale-boosting trip to Iceland, remains shrouded in conspiracy and wartime secrecy. This is the prince as a phantom of war, his life extinguished in the remote Highland mist. The wreckage on the craggy slope serves as a grim reminder that royal blood offers no immunity from the chaotic violence of global conflict. In the summer of 1183, the rebellion of Henry the Young King ends not in victory, but in a squalid room in Martel. Dying of dysentery while still in revolt against his father, Henry II, the prince undergoes a dramatic final act of contrition. He orders himself to be laid on a bed of ashes with a noose around his neck as a sign of his unworthiness. This is the prince as a tragic penitent, his ambition crushed by mortality. The scene captures the candlelit gloom of his final moments, where the crown he was never allowed to truly wear sits abandoned on a nearby stool. The year 1470 sees the young Lancastrian Prince of Wales, Edward of Westminster, become a pawn in a desperate diplomatic marriage. In the cold, vaulted interior of Angers Cathedral, he is betrothed to Anne Neville, daughter of the kingmaker Earl of Warwick, the man who had previously deposed Edward's own father. This is the prince as a political instrument, forced into a union with the family of his greatest enemy to secure a throne he would soon lose at Tewkesbury. The atmosphere is thick with incense and unspoken betrayal, as the two teenagers are bound together by the machinations of power-hungry elders. In 1511, for 52 glorious days, England celebrates the arrival of a New Year's boy. Prince Henry, the firstborn son of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, is the center of the most lavish tournament in Tudor history at Westminster. We see the prince as the ultimate symbol of dynastic hope, his cradle surrounded by golden tapestries and the sound of trumpets. However, the celebration is a fleeting illusion. The prince dies weeks later, leaving his father in a spiral of grief that will eventually reshape the English church. This scene captures the peak of Tudor pageantry before the long shadow of the succession crisis falls. By 1827, Prince William, the Duke of Clarence, finds his identity not in the court, but on the quarterdeck. Appointed as Lord High Admiral, the sailor prince brings a brusque naval discipline to the management of the Royal Navy. Unlike his more decadent brothers, William is defined by his connection to the sea and his obsession with naval reform. We see him on the deck of a ship of the line, surrounded by brass instruments and charts. His salt-crusted uniform, a testament to a life spent away from the gilded cages of London. He represents the prince as a professional officer, bridge building between the monarchy and the military machine. In 2001, the role of the prince undergoes a social experiment in anonymity. Prince William arrives at the University of St. Andrews under a strict media blackout agreement, attempting to live the life of an ordinary student. This is the prince as a civilian, a figure attempting to shed the weight of 1,000 years of history to gain a modern education. We see him walking through the ancient, wind-swept streets of the Scottish town, a satchel over his shoulder, blending into the crowd of students. This period represents a rare pause in the royal narrative, where the future king is allowed a brief glimpse of a world without constant scrutiny. The year 1399 finds the young Henry of Monmouth, the future Henry V, living a life of forced uncertainty. As his father, Bolingbroke, leads a rebellion in England, the 10-year-old prince is held as a hostage by King Richard II during the Irish campaign. Despite the conflict, Richard treats the boy with a strange, protective affection, even knighting him in a field of Irish gorse. This is the prince as a captive ward, caught between a failing king and a revolutionary father. The scene captures the boy in the rugged gray interior of Trim Castle, his fate hanging in the balance of a changing regime. In 2013, the prince's role as a soldier evolves into a mission of extreme physical endurance and advocacy. Prince Harry joins a team of wounded veterans for a grueling trek to the South Pole. Far from the luxury of the palace, he is depicted battling sub-zero temperatures and whiteout conditions, his identity merged with that of his comrades. This is the prince as a teammate, using his global platform to highlight the resilience of those broken by war. The vast, frozen landscape of Antarctica becomes a stage for a new kind of royal duty, one defined by shared suffering and the pursuit of a common, arduous goal. In the sweltering heat of July 1099, Prince Robert Curthose, the eldest son of William the Conqueror, leads the charge during the siege of Jerusalem. Having mortgaged his Duchy of Normandy to fund his crusade, Robert represents the prince as a holy warrior, seeking redemption and glory far from the damp forests of Europe. We see him at the foot of the city's ancient stone walls, clad in heavy chainmail, his face grim with the weight of religious fervor. This is the prince as a transnational figure, whose ambitions and piety drive him to the edge of the known world, sacrificing his inheritance for a crown of spiritual triumph. The year 1361 finds Prince Lionel of Antwerp, the giant son of Edward III, arriving in a fractured Ireland. As the king's lieutenant, he is tasked with halting the Gaelic resurgence that threatens English control. Within the cold, damp halls of Dublin Castle, Lionel presides over the drafting of the Statutes of Kilkenny, laws designed to prevent the English from adopting Irish customs, language, and dress. This is the prince as a cultural enforcer, attempting to use legislation to build a wall between two peoples. The scene captures the tension of a prince struggling to govern a land that refuses to be tamed. In September 1483, the northern city of York erupts in celebration for the investiture of Prince Edward of Middleham, the only son of Richard III. In a lavish ceremony at York Minster, the young boy is formally created Prince of Wales. However, beneath the velvet and gold, the prince is visibly frail, his pale face a stark contrast to his father's iron-willed ambition. This is the prince as a fragile hope, the sole pillar supporting a new and controversial dynasty. The scene depicts the hushed atmosphere of the cathedral, where the whispers of the boy's poor health carry more weight than the cheering crowds outside. By 1502, the education of the young Prince Henry, the future Henry VIII, takes a sharp turn toward the intellectual. Following his brother Arthur's death, Henry is groomed not just as a warrior, but as a humanist scholar. Within the sun-drenched library of Richmond Palace, we see him debating with the great scholar Erasmus. This is the prince as the quintessential Renaissance man, mastering theology, music, and Latin. The scene captures a rare moment of quiet focus, illustrating a mind that would later dismantle the religious foundations of his kingdom. Here seen merely as a brilliant youth surrounded by the weight of ancient knowledge. In the chaos of 1650, the English Civil War extends to the high seas through the exploits of Prince Maurice of the Rhine. Unlike his more famous brother Rupert, Maurice is a silent, pragmatic commander, leading a royalist privateering fleet in the Caribbean. We see him on the salt-stained deck of his flagship, staring into a gathering tropical storm. This is the prince as a maritime outlaw, using the ocean as a final frontier to keep the royal cause alive after the collapse of the land armies. The scene evokes the isolation of a prince who has lost his country but retains his command over the waves. The year 1795 brings a new vision for the British soldier under the command of Prince Frederick, Duke of York. Often remembered for his failures in the field, Frederick's true legacy is forged in the administrative halls of the Horse Guards. He establishes the Royal Military Asylum, ensuring the welfare of soldiers' children and reforming the corrupt system of purchasing commissions. This is the prince as a compassionate bureaucrat, modernizing the backbone of the empire. The scene shows the Duke at his desk, surrounded by blueprints for barracks and hospitals, his quill moving steadily through the night as he builds a professional army for the Napoleonic age. In the dawn of September 13th, 1882, Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, leads the Guards Brigade during the Battle of Tel el-Kebir in Egypt. As Queen Victoria's favorite son, his presence on the front lines is a source of intense anxiety for the court. We see him through the smoke and haze of the desert morning, sword drawn, as his men storm the Egyptian trenches. This is the prince as a professional officer, proving his worth in an age when royal military roles were increasingly ceremonial. The scene captures the transition of the prince into a leader of a global expeditionary force in the height of the Victorian era. By 1934, Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, finds himself in the role of a royal envoy to the furthest reaches of the empire. We see him in the dry, scrub-filled interior of Australia, inspecting a parade of veterans under a relentless sun. Unlike his more charismatic brothers, Henry is a career soldier, defined by a rigid sense of duty and a preference for the barracks over the ballroom. This is the prince as the steady, reliable servant of the crown, bridging the gap between the monarchy and the distant dominions during a decade of rising global instability. The scene highlights the vast, dusty scale of the imperial responsibility. In 2011, the Prince of Wales, William, serves as a flight lieutenant in the search and rescue force at RAF Valley in Anglesey. Far from the glamour of London, he is depicted in the cockpit of a yellow Sea King helicopter, navigating the treacherous winds and grey swells of the Irish Sea. This is the prince as a modern first responder, his royal identity submerged beneath the flight suit and the high-stakes mission of saving lives. The scene illustrates the 21st century prince's desire for a real job, finding purpose in the grit and technical demands of the military's humanitarian wing. On May 6, 2023, the ancient and the modern collide as Prince George serves as a page of honor at the coronation of his grandfather, King Charles III. Carrying the heavy, gold-trimmed robes of the monarch through Westminster Abbey, the 10-year-old prince is a central figure in a 1,000-year-old rite. This is the prince as a link in the eternal chain, a child bearing the literal weight of history. The scene captures the solemnity of the moment, the young boy's face focused and serious amidst the incense and the medieval splendor of the abbey, embodying the continuity of the royal line into the future. In the early 19th century, a different kind of prince existed in the shadows of the court, the natural sons of royalty. Prince William, Duke of Clarence, fathered 10 children with the actress Dorothea Jordan. Though barred from the succession, these Fitzclarences were raised as princes in all but name, navigating the treacherous waters of high society. We see George Fitzclarence, the eldest, in a dimly lit library, his face etched with the frustration of a man who possesses the blood of kings but lacks the legal status. This scene explores the precarious identity of the illegitimate prince, a recurring theme in the survival of the royal line. By the 1880s, the role of the prince moved into the realm of the scholar invalid. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, the youngest son of Queen Victoria, was a prince defined by his battle with hemophilia. In the quiet corridors of Oxford, Leopold is depicted surrounded by rare manuscripts, finding a strength in intellect that his body denied him in battle. This is the prince as the patron of the arts and sciences, a man whose life was a constant, calculated gamble against the slightest injury. The scene captures the fragile, intellectual dignity of a prince who redefined royal duty through the pursuit of knowledge. In March 1868, the role of the prince became a target for global political unrest. During a visit to Clontarf, Sidney, Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, was the victim of an assassination attempt by a Fenian sympathizer. We see the chaotic moment after the shot was fired. The prince slumped on the grass, his naval uniform stained, but his resolve firm. This was the first time a member of the royal family was targeted in the modern era, transforming the prince from a distant symbol into a vulnerable participant in the world's ideological struggles. The scene emphasizes the sudden shattering of royal security. The mid-19th century saw the prince as a bridge between two worlds, Britain and the ancestral lands of Hanover. Prince Adolphus, Duke of Cambridge, served as the Viceroy of Hanover, maintaining the German link that defined the dynasty for over a century. We see him in a grand, echoing palace hall in Germany, his uniform a blend of British and continental styles. This is the prince as the diplomatic anchor, a man whose life was spent balancing the interests of two nations. The scene highlights the end of the personal union between the two crowns and the prince's role in that delicate transition. In the 1970s, the royal line produced a prince who found his calling not in the military, but in the blueprint. Prince Richard, Duke of Gloucester, a trained architect, represents the prince as the professional preservationist. We see him in a modern drafting studio, leaning over plans for the restoration of a historic cathedral. This is the prince as the guardian of the nation's physical heritage, using technical expertise to bridge the gap between ancient stone and modern function. The scene illustrates the shift toward the working prince, whose contribution to the realm is measured in the survival of its historic skyline. Deep within the tradition of the monarchy lies the role of the prince as a humble servant during the royal Maundy. This ancient ceremony, where the prince assists the monarch in distributing symbolic alms to the elderly, reverses the usual flow of royal power. We see a young prince kneeling before an elderly recipient, the silver platters of Maundy money catching the dim light of a cathedral nave. This is the prince as the embodiment of Christian humility, a tradition that strips away the gold and focuses on the shared humanity of the king's subjects. The scene captures the solemn, ritualized grace of the event. By the 1980s, the prince's relationship with the land took a revolutionary, ecological turn. At Highgrove, Prince Charles began an experiment in organic farming and sustainability that was initially met with public skepticism. We see the prince in a worn Barber jacket, standing in a wildflower meadow at twilight, the house a dark silhouette in the background. This is the prince as the visionary steward, looking ahead to a century defined by environmental crisis. The scene illustrates the transition of royal duty from political governance to ecological leadership, finding a new purpose in the soil of the kingdom. In the 2020s, the prince's role as a patron has evolved into the Earthshot era, the prince as a global venture capitalist for the planet's survival. Prince William is seen on a high-tech stage, the blue glow of a digital world map illuminating his face. This is the prince as a catalyst for innovation, using the royal platform to accelerate technological solutions to climate change. The scene captures the intersection of ancient prestige and cutting-edge science, where the prince no longer commands armies, but coordinates the minds that will save the future. It is a moment of intense, focused urgency. The administration of the Duchy of Cornwall represents the prince as the ultimate steward of the land. For over 600 years, this private estate has funded the heir, but in the modern age, it has become a model for sustainable urban planning. We see the prince examining a model of Poundbury, a town built on principles of traditional architecture and human scale. This is the prince as the landlord philosopher, using his ancestral wealth to challenge the anonymity of modern development. The scene highlights the tangible brick-and-mortar influence the prince exerts on the British landscape outside the halls of Parliament. As the millennium concludes, the figure of the prince remains the perpetual heir, the living bridge between what was and what will be. In a final, symbolic tableau, we see a composite of the princes throughout time. The Saxon Etheling, the Crusader, the Tudor scholar, the Victorian sailor, and the modern environmentalist. They stand in the mist-filled ruins of an ancient abbey, their shadows merging into one. This is the essence of the prince, a role that survives through constant adaptation, embodying the hopes, flaws, and continuity of a nation. The cycle of the prince is an eternal, unfolding story of duty and survival.